Now, long ago, maybe 30 or 40 years ago, André Gunther Frank, who was a very close friend, very close, asked my mother the following question: since when Samir is a communist? And my mother gave the following answer: since the age of 6. And he was surprised. And she said the following: in order to understand the following, you should know, I should tell you, that my mother was medical doctor, and she was sharing her time in 2 periods. Half of the working time with rich people that she asked a lot of money from them, and the other half she was going in the popular classes to cure the people free, with no money at all. And I was in the car with my mother going there, and I was 6, and when I come out of the car with my mother, I see a child, a boy of my age, who was looking into the garbage, looking, and not poorly dressed, terribly poorly dressed, and naked, almost naked feet and so on. And I said, Mama, what is he looking after? And she says he is looking after something to eat. Why? He has nothing to eat? No, they are poor and they have nothing to eat. And I said, why is it so? My mother was progressive, pro-communist. She was not but pro. And she says, because the world is badly made. And I answered, we should change the world. And that was for her the proof that I was already communist. A number of years later, in the secondary school, the young people of my age, 12, 14, were divided in 3 camps. 20% no opinion. 40% claiming that they are communist. And 40% claim that they are nationalist. What it meant was those claiming that they were communist was that, 1, the Soviet Union is saving humankind from fascism and from colonialism. We'll get rid of colonialism thanks to them, to the victory, the coming victory over the fascists. And that, therefore, the solution to the dramatic problem for the poor people to become human beings is communism. There is no alternative. No, nothing else. The 40% who are calling themselves nationalists were saying, no, the only enemy of Egypt is imperialism. All the rest is not our problem. We should get rid of... It was like Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party, the divide, more or less. And the 20% who had no opinion, the other 80%, both the nationalists and the communists, we were looking at them as subhuman kind, of no interest. These are silly people, nothing to hope from them. But the 2 camps, the communists and the nationalists, were not discussing, were fighting every day. Insults, on anything. But there was some cross respect because we had opinions. So that was the 2nd chapter. And then I was fortunate enough that my family, my father was medical doctor, also Egyptian, my mother medical doctor, French, and both were, as I said, progressive. That is, my father was left Wafdist, to translate it for China, left Kuomintang of the 20s. That is, we have nothing, communists are allies. we find the same imperialism and social injustice. When there was the victory of Stalingrad, I was 11 years old, and there was a spontaneous big demonstration of the workers. Spontaneous big demonstration for that victory. My father took me there, and he said the following. I remember a number of things very precisely. The story I said at the age of 6, I remember it. I don't remember the words I said exactly, but I remember the fact that I was shocked, and the fact that my mother didn't tell me the usual bourgeois stupidity, oh, the world is so, there are poor and there are rich people. No, she says it's bad. World is poorly, society is not correctly organized. That I remember. Same I remember, after Stalingrad, my father told me, we have won, you see, we have won, they will have to leave. They meant the British imperialism. Associating that victory with the victory as a victory for the Egyptian people themselves. So these things remain to me. So I was convinced very early. And then there was a bookshop which was selling Marxist literature. I was quite advanced at school. I was curious of reading, and I went there. I was the age of 14 or 15, and find Lenin, State and Revolution, the Civil War in France, the publications of Marx. And I started to read that. And I was more and more convinced that this is fantastically strong and powerful analysis. So I was a member of the Communist Party very, very early, very, very early, at the age of 17. And that has made that I have discovered recently, very recently, that I was the only survived three important events, or not events, three important moments in our history, I would say, and to which I happen to have been associated personally. 1950 or 47 to 47 in France, the magazine Étudiants anti-colonialistes, anti-colonial students, which was bringing together the vanguard, not necessarily communists, but communist and radical nationalists of all colonies of that time, Africa, Middle East, Vietnamese, which was a French colony, together. A second was in 1950, and I'll tell you about that, I told it, our debate on Zhdanov report and the so-called Cold War that we rejected as such. And third was in 63, the magazine, the Maoist magazine, Revolution, which was published in English and French. In English, it was published in England, in London, by Babu, who happened to have been who made the revolution in Zanzibar, the leader of the revolution, died now. Now, when I looked at the members of the committees of those three magazines, I discovered that they had all died, that I happened to have been the younger and the last surviving. When Jacques Vergès died a year ago, I said, of revolution, which was 63, it was not so far, I am the last one. Kien, the Vietnamese, died 2 years ago. Viriato da Luz, the Angolese, 10 years ago, and so on. Then I went to the magazine Moyen-Orient, in which there was this debate. I will tell you about it more. I have told you, but maybe it's... and I found that after the death of Raymond Aguillon 5 years ago, I was the last survivor. So I said, well, I ought perhaps to write something about that in my memories, because to my knowledge, none of the people who have died have left published. Maybe there are writings here and there in their drawings at home, but nothing published. And it would be... Now, the first journal, magazine, Étudiant anti-colonialiste, we were a group of communists belonging to communist parties, of Egypt, of Vietnam, of course, but Vietnamese were quite independent because the war, and they were very marginal. And Syrians, Iraqis, people from Madagascar, and I don't know, Algerians. And around us, there was a mass of students who were anti-colonialists, anti-imperialists, but with little understanding of more than that. So we were very active among them to politicize them more, and we decided not to organize ourselves as we had a small nucleus who met apart, but to create an organization with all of us, so that we would be on equal footing in the discussion with them. And some of the French communists were very critical to us, saying that this was opportunistic, that we should put our red flag up, etc., etc., which we thought was not very clever. And there were, but at that time, any communist in the world would be a member of the Communist Party of the country where he is. And therefore, it was the rule of the Third International. Communism is international. So we were simultaneously members of the French Communist Party. But we had difficult relations. And the matter went, we were accused of all kinds and sorts, according to the rule of the time, of deviations, leftist deviation, rightist, no, that was rightist deviation. We were more nationalists than communists and so on, which was not true, etc. And the matter went up to Maurice Thorez, the Secretary General of the party, because the Secretary of the Federation of Paris asked the permission to put us out of the French Communist Party. And we say, no, we are allowed to, and we are communists, so it's our party also, in the country in which we are living for some time as students. And it went up to Maurice Thorez, and Maurice Thorez, I was attending that meeting, I was young, and there was an elder who was Jacques Vergès from La Réunion, the island in the Indian Ocean. And so Maurice Thorez said, the representative of this group, Jacques Vergès, say what you have to say, he said. The Secretary of the Federation of Paris said that what you have to say, he said it, and Maurice Thorez said, those young people are right. They will remain in the party. That was an event. We were very happy of that, and we could continue. Second business was Moyen-Orient. There was a group of communists of Egypt. Again, I was the younger one. In 1950, I was 19 years old, and 51, 20 years old. And a group of communists from Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Iran. Iran was the major because they had a so-called big party at the time, Tudeh, and Iskandarani was the former Secretary General of the party, but he was in exile in Paris, had decided together that we should publish a magazine on the Middle East. And, well, we were discussing, there were elders, all elders. The Egyptian one were Fouad Morsi, who became the Secretary General of the party, and Ismail Abdallah, who became the Deputy Secretary General of the party, and was also, I could say, my boss directly in the party. And we were discussing, and then it was 1950, 2 years before, just 2 years before, well, 3 years before there was the famous, it's not Truman who invented the Cold War. Truman was unable to invent anything. It was Churchill who was thinking for him. And Churchill invented this affair of the Iron Curtain, and the world is divided in two sets of countries. Totalitarian communist countries and free countries, freedom, all the rest of the world, including the colonies. Now, that was the Cold War, the declaration of the Cold War. A year later, Zhdanov, which means Stalin, published his famous report, in which he says, more or less the same, the world is divided in two camps. The camp of socialism, United States, Soviet Union, and Eastern Europe. China was not yet, the war was continuing, but not yet victory. It was on the eve of the victory. And the capitalist world, all the rest. We were not convinced by Zhdanov's report. We said, well, we are in the capitalist world, but we are dominated people in struggle against it. So the world is that we cannot be put, well, Churchill say we are the free area. Free for what? For capital, huh? Not for us as people. Dominated. And so how is it that we are looked at? That was the theory of the Cold War. There are only two forces, Soviet Union and United States. The rest of the world doesn't exist. They are either our allies or their allies, but by themselves they do not exist. So we were not happy with that, but we were all communists of that time. We were very convinced that Moscow was directing correctly the Third International, the global communist movement, and that probably we have not understood everything. So we decided to write a very polite letter saying, but how is it that there is not a single line on the fact that the so-called capitalist world is imperialist dominating countries and colonies and semi-colonies dominated? It's not homogeneous. We are not two worlds, we are three worlds. Socialist, imperialist capitalist, and dominated by imperialist capitalist. Three worlds. And 1 year later, it was 1950, it was just the victory in China. And Mao and Zhou Enlai were there. So we said, we were accustomed, we said we shall send this letter both to Moscow and to Beijing, to the two big brothers, the Soviet Communist Party and the Chinese Communist Party. And we sent it. Now, a year later, Wang Hui, a Chinese who died a few years ago, who was posted in Bern in Switzerland. It was the only embassy of China at that time in the West. There were no embassy elsewhere. Come to visit us and tells us, Chu Enlai tells you, but don't write it and don't say it, don't publish it. Think by yourself, which was a very diplomatic way of saying, you are not necessarily wrong. But
it's a very Chinese way.
Yeah, he didn't say you are right, because it would have meant that Zhdanov was wrong. And that was not the way at that time. But he did not say you are wrong and Zhdanov is right. He said, think by yourself, which we were doing. And I wanted to check the veracity of that, because later in 1963, when we created the magazine, the Maoist magazine Revolution, it was Wang Hui who came again to see us. It was 12 years later. But he was still in the team of Chu Enlai, dealing with the relations of the Communist Party and the foreign affairs of China with a number of people, of communists, elsewhere. So I asked him, is it correct? And he told me, you are correct. And said, now I shall publish it. Because it should be said, it should be known. And we are no more in 1951 to take care of what would be thought in Moscow or elsewhere. So these are the three stories. The magazine Revolution was Maoist, but was Maoist of within communist parties or liberation movements of Africa, basically, of the Portuguese colonies, Angola, Mozambique, Cabo Verde, of Algeria, Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, where there were communists, and from the left, the radical left within RDA, the major parties of national liberation in Africa. We were boycotted by the South African Communist Party, which was aligned on Moscow completely aligned. I saw Joe Slovo much later after the fall of apartheid, and he said, oh, Samir, I said, you remember, Joe, you were defending Soviet Union. I'm not happy that it has disappeared. No. It is a catastrophe, but it is a catastrophe that should have been expected, unfortunately. And he said, well, now it is past, let's be together. Okay. Now, and we were independent. We were producing whatever we thought the Marxist, Maoist analysis of what was going on in our respective countries. It's up to the comrades and readers today to see if we were right or wrong. There is no guarantee that we were right. It's not because we claim to be Maoist that we are automatically right. No, not at all. But recently, I had saved a number of archives of the Egyptian Communist Party of the very crucial period, 54 to 57. That is a year or two before Bandung and a year or two after Bandung. And for Egypt, it was the time of the radicalization of Nasserism, anti-imperialist radicalization, the nationalization of the Suez Canal, Bandung before, and then the military aggression of Britain, France, and Israel, October 56, and then following it, the move to the left to a kind of state capitalism with some degrees of state socialism in Egypt as of 57. And reading those papers recently, last year, that is after the movement has started again in Egypt since 2011, I find that they are terribly modern, because they are dealing with exactly the same conflicts and the same debates that we have today in Egypt, except that in the previous time the people had a culture, and a Marxist culture, and therefore the arguments was argued seriously. Now they have no culture. It's the movement spontaneous, so anything correct or incorrect, blah blah, can be said without, I'm not dogmatic saying we need a reference to, but without even a capacity to analyze. And I decided to republish them. And republish first the documents as they are, not changing a single line, but also with a long presentation of mine why those debates are relevant today, and helping the reader, the young Egyptian of today, who does not know the names and the places and so on which were referred in the documents, explaining what it was, because the knowledge of history is lost. So this is, in a summary, why I think that it is important to remind, to remember. Not just to remember because we are proud of, no, but because it's useful. It's the same battle which continues and which will continue for a long time. I mean, we are not moving into, for me, communism is a higher stage of civilization. Maybe when I was 25 years old, as everybody of this age, I was convinced that we'll see it, I'll see it, if I live until even 25 more years, I'll see it. Now I am convinced that it's a matter of 2 or 3 centuries. It's not a matter, you do not change society in a few years. You start changing a number of rules, but then for the people to get to play, to get new ways of understanding and of acting, it takes generation after generation. Okay?
Yes. Well, for many communist parties or sects, very often they are sectarian.
Yeah.
But you are not sectarian at all. You are very open.
I am not sectarian. I was sectarian when I was of the age of 20 or 25, for sure, when we were all Stalinists and sectarian. We were all educated in a very dogmatic way of reading classics, whether Marx, Lenin, and even Mao. We discovered Mao when it was translated into Western languages, among which French, in 1952, New Democracy. Before it was not. But we were dogmatic. And that was the time. And it was the general education. But I think that, yes, personally I got distance from it quite quickly. That is, I was not Maoist as I had been Stalinist 20 years earlier. No. I was Stalinist at the age of 17 to 25, normal. Isabel was not. Isabel was not. She was a communist, but she said, "You are a Stalinist." I shall never say, "Long live Stalin." What does it mean? He will die as everybody. Huh? So don't think it that way. She was more advanced than that. You know, the international song says, in French, it's ni Dieu, ni César, ni tribun. No God, no Caesar, no emperor, no tribun, no charismatic leader. And she has put it in plural. No gods, no leaders, no charismatic leaders, and no emperors. Plural. It's the people who do history. It's not those ones. Huh? So, but when as of 57, I was in Egypt, and it was obvious that Chinese Communist Party and Soviet Communist Party had disagreement openly, appearing openly, or appearing. It appeared openly in 60, but appearing. I was carefully reading all the views which were distributed in pamphlets, in articles, and so on, by both, by the Soviet and by the Chinese. And I must say, I was more convinced by the Chinese argument. Because the Chinese argument was taking into account the importance of the gigantic movement of liberation, anti-imperialist of Asia and Africa, potentially anti-capitalist, potentially, and who could become potentially the major tool against capitalism. This is why we were very enthusiastic with the Vietnam, because Vietnam was giving the lesson of associating a hard liberation war. They are the only country who defeated the Americans, not the French, the Americans, and associated with really a vision of building socialism. Whatever were the limitation, as in China, as in Soviet Union, as elsewhere, of that time, but that. And they did it successfully. So we were very enthusiastic about Vietnam. And I think we ought to, it's correct, we were not wrong. We were right. So, but when we declared ourselves, then came 68 in France, you know, the mass movement of the youth. And I happened to, at that time I was already teaching at the university. I was professor already, since 1 year before. And it was amusing in some way, because we had all kinds of movements, pseudo-politicized, communist, Marxist, Marxist-Leninist, Maoist of 3 or 4 kinds, and anarchist of 4 or 5 kinds, Trotskyites, everything existing. And I was laughing because among the Maoist or so-called Maoists, different, we were meeting often as friends or as... And I was saying, there are 2 kinds of Maoists. There are the Maoists, or who try to understand and try to think to which extent the experience of China is meaningful for us, to which extent. And those who are exactly behaving with China as the other has behaved with Soviet Union. That is, reading between the line an article, a very ordinary article in, what's the newspaper? Renmin what?
The People's Daily.
The People's Daily, and derive from it enormous things. And we were laughing at that. We were saying, no, it's not the way. It's not learning what Mao has written. It's trying to understand the relation between what Mao has written, the challenges for the Chinese people and the communists within the Chinese people at that time, and trying to understand it. And then, to which extent that is useful for us. Oh, we have conditions which are so different, to which extent it is same or different. So that helped us to move out of dogmatism quite early. In many cases, people were compelled to have two faces. One quite official, but the other what they thought, really. And that was, the dogmatism produces that, just as in religions also. Dogmatic religion produces also people who start thinking, well, let's put nuances in all that. What I can say is that indirectly, you know, the Chou Enlai affair was very indicative that there were people in China, as important as Chou Enlai, who are probably of that kind, who are for sure of that kind, that is deeply convinced by Marxism, by socialist and communist target, but also continuously asking himself, is it correct to do it this way or that way? Not so arrogant to say, we know, we have the keys and so on. So it was more frequent than we knew. When I remember the debates within the Egyptian communists, and this is why I published those documents, it's obvious that they were different views. Obvious. Even if there was a common language which hides those differences. No, everything. I'm not saying, I have not this arrogance to say that everything that I have written was beautiful, perfect, and correct. But I always try to articulate my arguments, and I can, with the distance of time, think that, well, that was not enough, and that was even perhaps wrong. But understand why one had thought in that way and not in another way. You see, another thing that I would like to say, I wrote it also recently. I happen to have read Capital 4 times in my life, and curiously every 20 years, at the age of 20, 40, 60, and 80, which, by pure chance, did correspond to important changes in society and the world system. 20 years old was the immediate after war. The start of the so-called Cold War, which I never called Cold War. Cold War was an invention, a strategy of the West. And the thing was 3 systems, I say that, not 2. And that was what Mao understood, and what made me sympathetic reading of what Mao was saying. Yeah? Second time, it was in around 1970 or 60, mid-60s. It was 68, and it was the Bandung and the a number of victories, even if limited victories, of national independence of Africa. 20 years later, it was the beginning of neoliberalism, the breakdown of Soviet Union, the turn in China after Mao, and for 20 years later, it is now. It is the start of the breakdown of the so-called neoliberal globalization, which appear clearly to be unsustainable, and is understood as unsustainable by more and more people in struggle. So each time I read Capital, I read it in the light of, does it help me understanding what is happening now? I read it, therefore, differently. Each time I find very important things, clever, important, but each time I was thinking, Capital does not answer to my questions. Therefore, let us look at Marx, not as the founder of Marxism, a finished product, but as the starter of a systematic, really scientific and revolutionary understanding of what is capitalism. But he has not provided answers. He has started. And therefore, it is the task of everybody who claim to be Marxist to continue. Well, he will not also produce the final product. There will never be a final product because history has no end. That is my way of reading Marxism. It's not lack of respect. I think I learned everything that I know there, but there is no final answer to any question.